welcome to What is a Movement? This is the first in a series of 3 network weaving events for Transition Together. That's the team that's dedicated to supporting the transition movement in Britain. The network weaving team is working to deepen Transition Together's understanding of groups across Wales and England, especially. And we want to use our work to grow our relationships with each other and hold a dialogue about the kind of future we want to build together. And that's either at a national or a regional scale. So to help with this, we're running these 3 sessions through November. So tonight's one on movements, the second one on assemblies next week, and a third one on networks. That's the week after. And these sessions have been designed as a way of preparing the ground for our upcoming transition assembly. That's in February, which is going to be a 2-day gathering for people involved in transition across England and Wales. And that will include a People's Assembly type event, which will help us decide a way together, a way forward together. And if you haven't already signed up to those other events, we'll be sharing the links. We can put that in the chat now, and we'll be sharing the links to sign up to these other 2 events and the Transition Assembly in the follow-up email after today. So I've already said my name. I'm Jess. I'm one of the network weavers for Transition Together. We're a growing team, actually. There's about 4 or 5 of us, and we distributed regionally, and that's actually a couple more people coming on board the team in the next few weeks as well. And our job is to reach out to groups across England and Wales, chat to everybody, and work out how we can make decisions together, what our common priorities are, what draws us together, both now and in the future. So I'd like to just take a moment to introduce our speakers tonight, and then I'm just going to launch straight in, actually. So I'm here just to introduce people and to facilitate questions later on. And in addition to working for Transition Together, I also do work for Transition Stroud in Gloucestershire as well. So I'm also part of transition group at the grassroots level, as well as being part of the national team. So I'm also joined tonight by my amazing colleague, Phil Frodsham, who is also a network weaver. He's based more northerly than me, and he's also a member of his own transition group in Transition New Mills, that's in Derbyshire. So he'll be kicking off the evening tonight, setting the scene for us and asking the crucial question, where are we now as a transition movement? And once he's done that, and asked a few really, I hope, critical questions that will pique all of our imaginations and inspire us all, we're really honoured to be joined by Peter Laffour as well. I don't know if he's going to give a wave. Thank you. He's worked in movements and networks for over a decade now. He's worked with the Eden Project as well as Oxfordshire CAG, who actually are going to be presenting in 2 weeks at the network session as well. And he's currently at the University of Exeter. He's also a climate coach, freelance facilitator, and was a trustee for Transition Network for 7 years. So a really lovely friend to have. And later we'll also be listening to Imandeep Kaur, who's the co-founder and director of Civic Square. Imi also spent the last decade convening and building community, understanding the role of citizens in radical systemic change, and working on how we can create more democratic, distributed, open source, social and civic infrastructure together. So we'll be hearing from all our 3 speakers first. So altogether that will be about 40 minutes, but we will log your opportunities for questions for afterwards. So we're going to ask a couple of direct questions to our speakers afterwards, and then we'll have an open discussion time as well. So I'm just going to hand straight over to Phil, because that's definitely enough from me. Would you like to help us introduce and frame our session, Phil?
Yeah, nice one, Jess. Really appreciate it. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about movements. What are they? Where are we in terms of the transition movement? Where are we in terms of the wider climate and social justice movement? So to quote from the Transition Network website, transition is a movement of communities coming together to reimagine and rebuild our world. So what is a movement? And in terms of movements, where are we now? What have we got to offer? What are we saying as a movement? Where are we going as a movement? What role do we play in the climate and social justice movement? How do we work in solidarity with others? Who are we? So these are really big questions and really important questions that I feel that we have to ask. I'm going to start with a very brief overview of the wider climate movement to help put these questions into some kind of context. So I would like us just to go back in time to 2018 and 2019. I'm going to set the scene a little bit there. So Extinction Rebellion started in 2018, and they declared that every part of society must act now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. Their first major action was to occupy the London Greenpeace offices in October 18, and then that was followed by their public launch at the Declaration of Rebellion, and that was later that month outside Parliament. And about 100 academics signed a call of action in their support. In November 18, 5 bridges across the River Thames in London were blockaded as a protest. In April 19, Extinction Rebellion occupied 5 prominent sites in central London: Piccadilly Circus, Oxford Circus, Marble Arch, Waterloo Bridge, and the area around Parliament Square. Some of us may even have been at those sites. So the alarm bell was well and truly rung in 18 and 19. Out of this, Fridays from the Future were organised. They started a global strike in March 19, and they gathered more than 1 million strikers in 2,200 strikes organised across 125 countries. In May 19, at their second global strike, 1,600 protests across 150 countries, and it drew hundreds of thousands of strikers. The May protests were timed to coincide with the 2019 European parliamentary elections. In September 19, the Global Week for the Future was a series of 4,500 strikes across 150 countries. Likely the largest climate strikes in world history, the strikes of the 20th of September that year gathered roughly 4 million protesters, many of them school children, 1.5 million people in Germany, for example. And then later on in September, an estimated 2 million people participated in demonstrations worldwide, including an estimated 1 million protesters in Italy and several 100,000 protesters in Canada. So hearing of these developments in 2018, the then Green Party politician Carla Denyer, then a member of Bristol City Council, took the lead role in bringing about Bristol City Council's declaration of a climate emergency. This was the first such declaration in Europe, and has been widely credited as a breakthrough moment for cities and parliaments beginning to declare climate emergencies. Denyer's motion was described in the Independent newspaper as the historic first motion. And by July 19, it had been copied by more than 400 local authorities across the country. In April 19, Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of the Scottish Government, declared a climate emergency at the SNP conference. The Climate Change Act was passed in September 19. The following day, the Welsh Government declared a climate emergency, which was subsequently passed by its own Parliament in May 2019. And it became the first in the world to officially declare a climate emergency. Later on in that afternoon, the UK Parliament followed. And here in the Transition Network, over 300 groups were operating in the UK alone, with transition hubs all around the world, building repair cafes, community gardens, local currencies, climate cafes, sustainable travel projects. And as Rob Hopkins said, if we act as individuals, it will be too little, but if we act as communities, it might just be enough, and it might just be in time. And it certainly felt like it could, and it could possibly be just enough for us all at that time. So if you did ask me, maybe at the beginning of 2020, about the climate movement, I think I would have found it quite easy to describe this. But then came COVID. So I'm in New Mills in Derbyshire, and the group that I'm part of, Transition New Mills, for example, we'd worked with our council to declare a climate emergency. And we used this to hold a people's assembly in the town that attracted 100 people. And we genuinely felt that we were riding a wave of optimism and hope. But then we went into lockdown and all of the energy was lost. And to be honest, I'm not sure that we fully recovered from that. It's difficult to say if things are better or worse post-COVID, but they are certainly different. This is a different landscape, a different context than the one that we found ourselves in 2018, 19, and 20. So on one hand, time, direction, and energy were all lost. But on the other hand, technologies such as Zoom made it easier for us to connect with each other. And this was crucial for many marginalized communities around the globe. So where are we now? What is our current context? Last night's news from the US really ended any lingering hopes we may have had of keeping to within 1.5 degrees. Project 25 is a political initiative published by the American conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, in 2023, and it counts Donald Trump as one of its supporters. The project aims to promote conservative right-wing policies, to reshape the federal government in the United States, and to consolidate executive power under a Trump presidency. Now, we still don't know how far Trump will go, but Project 25 advises a future Republican president to go further than merely nullifying Biden's executive orders on climate change and to, quote, eradicate climate change references from absolutely everywhere in order to end a supposed government effort to, quote, control people. Far-right authoritarian governments are a clear and present danger to all of our work and to each of us individually. And after last night, it doesn't really take much of a leap to imagine such a pathway in the UK. So what now for the climate and social justice movement, and what now for the transition movement? Earlier today, Chris Packham tweeted, "Things have just got a lot more difficult, but here's what I think. I have no control over what just happened, none. But I do have control over how I will react to it. And I'm not going to give up on the beautiful and the good. The grip on my dreams just got even tighter." So these are times of change and real challenge in our world and in our own work. Times when a shared vision and firm foundations will be the key to our future. It's often been said that those who tell the stories rule the world. The idea that narrative has the power to shape the world and govern conduct rests on one particular critical insight, and that is that narrative is the most important tool that we have for giving meaning to diverse actions, events, and states of affairs. Narrative literally helps to build movements. George Monbiot, in his recent book on neoliberalism, suggested this as a story that we can build a movement on. Quote, "Disorder afflicts this land, caused by the powerful and nefarious forces of people who tell us that our highest purpose in life is to fight like stray dogs over a dustbin. But the heroes of the story, the common people, long deprived of the democratic power we were promised, will revolt against this disorder. We will fight those nefarious forces by building rich, engaging, collaborative, inclusive, and generous communities. And in doing so, we will restore harmony to the land." To quote Rob Hopkins again, "It's my belief that we will create the future we long for only because we are able to master the art of telling the most compelling stories, stories that are delicious, irresistible, mesmerizing, stories that cultivate a deep, deep longing." So our question is, what is our shared story now? Or are we sharing many, many stories? Is the story we shared pre-COVID the same story that we share post-COVID? The transition movement in the UK feels like we're at a really crucial point in our development. And it feels right that we collectively take a step back at this moment and reflect upon our rich, rich history, a history of creativity, of connection, of change making, of storytelling, of making a difference. So over the past few months, network weavers like myself have been busy connecting with groups all over Wales and England, listening deeply to their hopes, their fears, their dreams, and sharing their stories with others in our movement. In February next year, we will come together at the Transition Assembly in Manchester to collectively decide where we want to go to next. How will we connect? How will we organize ourselves? How will we make decisions together? And what stories will we tell? How can we build this movement? So I'm going to end with the questions I started with. in 2024, 25, what is a movement? What is the transition movement? And in terms of movements, where are we now? What have we got to offer? What are we saying? Where are we going? How do we work in solidarity with others? And again, who are we? We were almost in 2025, the year that Extinction Rebellion demanded that we move to net zero by. But the world is a different place than it was in 2018 and 2019. So these are really big, big questions. And it genuinely feels exciting that together we've got the opportunity to answer these. I look forward to doing that with you all over the next 4 or 5 months. Thank you. Back to Jess now.
Thank you so much, Phil. As ever, very succinct and moving. We will get an opportunity to chat about some of the really important questions you just raised. I just want to move over to Peter's contribution now, because I think he's probably going to give us a really good grounding in what that wider landscape of movements is that we're operating against to inform our discussion later on in the session. So am I okay to move over to you, Peter?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Thanks as well, Phil, for that lovely introduction to some of the issues that we're talking about. So yes, hi everyone, I'm Peter. I've been introduced to waste more time on that. And I've been invited to respond to these questions. Why are movements important? What could a movement help us to do? Within that broader question of what is a movement? And there's lots we could say about that, talking about how do we define a movement, or what's the difference between a movement and a network? And we can absolutely get into those things later if that feels useful. But I think I want to focus particularly on this idea of why are they useful, why are they important, and really build on Phil's idea of storytelling. Because I think we can think of movements very much as types of stories that we tell. So when I was invited to do this, what I started doing was, in subsequent meetings with just whoever I was talking to, I was trying to ask everybody I spoke to, what's the first example of a movement that comes into your head? And this is the list of the suggestions that people came up with. Some of them were repeated, and some of them are quite similar. And it got me thinking a few questions about what's that process people go through when we think about movements. And one of them is, how do we judge whether a movement is a good example or a bad example, or successful or a failure? What does success or failure even mean for a movement? How do we conceptualize that? When does it end? Is a movement that something that has a clear end, or can kind of fizzle out a little bit? And how do we think about movements that are happening right now? A lot of these movements are things that are quite historic, and maybe they are still continuing. But it's quite difficult, particularly when we're thinking about storytelling. Stories are much more easy to tell and compelling when they have an ending. But a lot of the movements that we're in now don't have that luxury. So how do we tell those stories? And it made me think about transition itself. You know, when I started being aware of transition, peak oil was the thing that we were talking about. That was the kind of the thing behind the movement. And now when I think about it, I think about Rob's imagination work. I think about the amazing work that Abya are doing in the Latin American continent around regeneration and decolonization, and it's all connected to peak oil, but it feels very different. And is that the same movement? And is that the same story told in a different way? And these felt like a good place to start. So thinking about movements and thinking about stories, I was then thinking about, okay, well, let's park social movements for a minute and think about other types of movement. This is a timeline of the Romantic movement. I am absolutely not an art history scholar, so that I don't really understand what's going on here. But it's interesting to think about movements that are quite historic, and the way we talk about them, the way we think about them in this very linear way. This one literally starts with someone being born and ends with another person being dying. And it's an interesting story here. Like, what would have happened if this Romantic movement didn't take place? Would there have been something else? And so when we think about a similar thing for social movements, this is something from the Seattle Times, where they've tried to map significant social movements. Often we do it in a similar way. We have these kind of moments that feel important and feel significant, and we can put them into a timeline of this is the story of the movement. And it's quite a linear process. It's easy to understand and it's easy to articulate, but does it really encapsulate what is going on? within that movement, in the same way that a timeline of people being born and dying and writing things doesn't encapsulate what the Romantic movement was about. And it makes you think about this trap we have about causation and correlation. You know, just because things happen in a particular order doesn't mean that they cause each other. And if we're to really understand and tell compelling stories about what's happened in the past, but also what's happening now, we have to stop falling into particular traps of, well, this thing happened because this happened before it. There are elements of truth in that, but it's also quite an imprisoning narrative device. And it means we're going to tell quite similar stories about what movements are. Because we're very good as human beings at being in our little boxes and telling these quite linear stories of, okay, we did A, then we got to B, and then every now and then we open the box and we realize, okay, the world is maybe not quite as simple as we are, as the stories that we're telling. And there's reasons why we oversimplify, and there's a reason why we tell these stories in order to make sense of the world around us. But we also, at the same time, have to remember that these stories do not represent what is happening in the world around us. There's a lot we don't see. There's a lot we don't understand. And we're coming from very, very specific perspectives. So how do we balance these things? This need to make sense of what's going on and not be constantly overwhelmed all the time with mitigating the risk of oversimplifying things and therefore leading to unintended consequences. And part of this is around, you know, the relationship we have with the past and the relationship we have with the future. We think, you know, we're looking towards the future, but we're also thinking about the past and thinking, well, things happened like this then, therefore they're likely to happen like that now. And there's a lot of useful stuff in there, and in terms of, okay, movements in the past and movements now, what are we expecting? What feels like success in a movement? We're learning from the past. But again, this can be quite a misleading idea. You know, the past might be quite clear and bright, but the future's quite difficult to make out. And this kind of cause and effect of past and future is very much shaped by our language and our culture. You know, there are cultures and there are languages that have the opposite space-time mapping. You know, there are languages where people talk about forward to represent the past because we can see the past, and back behind is the future because we can't see it, which is a whole nother conversation we can get into. But these things are culturally created, and so the more aware we are of them, the more effective the stories we tell can be. And a key part of this is thinking about, right, okay, well, what is a movement trying to do? A movement is trying to make some kind of change. All of the definitions that I've read about movements refer to some kind of change, but there are quite different types of change. So thinking about dropping something in some water, for example, if we have this, you know, cup or glass or whatever it is, and we drop something in that, the state of the system is irreparably changed. There's water everywhere. It's no longer a nice, neat, contained glass. We've changed that system. Whereas if we drop something into a lake or an ocean, yeah, there's an immediate splash, but quite quickly, the system reorganizes itself around that. And our splash just turns into ripples and then kind of falls away. And so the impact of these two things feels quite different. And so our actions are incredibly contextual. What is the system that we're trying to change, and how much power does it have to reorganize itself around the impact that we are trying to make? And to demonstrate this and get into the framework that I wanted to share about networks, I want to do a little exercise. So I'm going to invite you in a second, everybody, to put their hand in the air. Not just yet, but what I'm going to do is just try and create an example movement. So the movement here we're creating is a movement of people who go around with their hands in the air. And whatever we've created, we've figured out somehow that if we do that, then we're much more likely to generate environmental and social justice. So it doesn't matter which hand you put up, it doesn't matter how high it is, but if I can invite you now to put your hands in the air, and we'll just demonstrate this idea of, okay, how is a movement generated? Excellent. Thank you, everybody. So we can break down this process into a few different forms. Okay, so I tried to create this movement, and we started off with a trigger. So the thing that seemed like it made the difference was this policy I just brought in. Okay, right, we're going to have our hands up. That's the thing. That's the trigger. But there were other things going on there as well. There were some enabling conditions that I put in place. So I gave us clear information. This is what I'm going to ask you to do. It's something that most people, not everybody, have the physical ability to do. It's relatively simple. It's not complicated. And it's also quite fun and playful. You know, if I told you the thing you had to do was like break an item of furniture in your room, probably fewer people would do it. So there are some conditions there that made that easier, that built us momentum towards this movement that we've generated. And there were also some feedback loops. So this idea of this isn't a linear process, we do something, there is feedback. And some of these feedback loops are supportive of what we did. So there's social contagion and a critical mass. We saw some people put their hands up and then a lot of people followed. If nobody else did, it probably would have been quite difficult for this movement to start. But as I can already see some hands going down, we're also starting to get to that point of, okay, now there are some oppositional feedback loops in action. So there's a deeper social contagion to the one that supported it in the first place. Now we're starting to think, this is a bit weird now. Maybe there's someone else in the room with me and they're looking at me thinking, why have they got their hands in the air? This feels like too long to have your hand in the air for no particularly good reason. So there's something else going on there. There's also physical feedback loops. It's starting to get quite painful and uncomfortable. There's a buildup of lactic acid in our arms and eventually we can just all put our hands down. So thank you very much for bearing with me. We can put our hands down. So this is kind of an example of what could be described as a failed movement. So I tried to do something. We had initial success. We had some momentum behind it, but there were some feedback loops that opposed what we were trying to do. And eventually the dominant system, the status quo, which is we don't all have our hands in the air all of the time, reasserted itself. And kind of we formed around that. And what we can take from this, other than, you know, this is quite a silly example that's not, you know, is not something realistic, but it articulates this idea that when we try and change a system, a complex system or even a complicated system, it's incredibly difficult and it's not a linear process. We can't just do something and expect a particular result. There are lots of things going on. And systems, dominant systems, are dominant for a particular reason because they're very good at responding to what we do to try and change them and reacting accordingly. So when we think about movements and we think about momentum, we need to consider these ideas of, well, what actually is it that can tip something from resistance into momentum? And so we have more, you know, what would it be that could have pushed us into, well, suddenly this is a movement that's caught on and has created deep and long-lasting change. And so there's various ways we can break this down. And here is a mathematical model, which is articulating the idea of tipping points. So we have this system on the left-hand side and it's moving around. There's a lot of noise, but it's not getting anywhere. But its movement, its noise is shifting the environment around it until we get to a moment where suddenly the resistance shifts into momentum and that ball moves into the second part of that system. So it felt like it happened all of a sudden, like it was just a sudden change overnight. But what caused that thing to happen was all of the work that went in before that moment, that noise, that slowly eroded the resistance and built momentum. And we can articulate this in a slightly more graphically pleasurable way, which is this concept of a tipping point. And so tipping points, I think, are a really powerful idea. And it's important to say, you know, not everything is a tipping point. This isn't something we can apply to every single situation. But when we think about movements, I think it can be a really helpful way of thinking about how are we telling these stories. And the general idea of a tipping point is, as this image articulates, is we're trying to get from basin A to basin B, so where we currently are, to this new system, in whatever context we might be talking about, however global or local. And the system state is represented by this blue ball, and we have to push it up this hill. It's not a linear process from A to B. We've got to get up this hill. So we're facing resistance to that change. And if we don't get to the top, and we lose our energy, we lose our momentum, we're going to roll all the way back down to where we started. But if we do pass that tipping point, then we shift from the resistance we're facing into momentum. So that tipping point being a really important moment where we haven't reached the change that we're working towards. We haven't got the thing that we want to happen yet. But now there is momentum behind that system. And the system, rather than adapting and self-regulating back to how it was, it's now adapting in support of the change that we're seeing. And we see this in ecological systems, we see this in technological systems, and we also see it in social systems. And sometimes it's negative, thinking about glacial melt or deforestation. But we can also very much have environmentally and socially positive tipping points. And so it's really helpful to think in this way, because we can also think about this tipping point as this moment of change where, if you imagine this not as a 2D image, but a 3D image, we're rolling the ball to the top of the hill. If you let a ball go at the top of the hill, it could roll to where you want it to roll, or it could roll to any one of almost an infinite number of other states, which makes this moment of tipping even more important. If we have a movement and we're working towards change, some kind of disequilibrium or disruption, when we reach that tipping point and we get into this area where suddenly the dominant system is losing stability and losing control, it becomes a really important part of social movements that could create this space where anything feels possible now, and it could be what we want, but it could also be co-opted by other agents who actually want us to get to a different state. And this is a really important part of thinking about social movements, is if we're pushing for change, what kind of change are we opening ourselves up for? So what does it mean to push against the dominant system, whether it regulates against us or starts to support that change? And we can break that down into all sorts of ways. Well, how do we think about these different parts? The creating the conditions for change that need to be in place, or we can't even get started. Thinking about the feedback loops that might support or oppose the work that we're trying to do. And what are those triggers that might tip us from one thing into the other? And so let's take as an example something like beach cleaning. Yeah, so here's beach cleaning as something which is an amazingly successful movement in terms of scale and growth. And where did that come from? So there were a lot of conditions in place. It's quite specific in small, generally coastal areas, naturally, as it's beach cleaning. Very clear information. This is what we want to do. It's sometimes we'll make it. We'll give you litter pickers. We'll give you bags. It becomes quite fashionable, quite stylish, quite fun to do. It's something that's accessible to most people and is fairly convenient. You can do it when you're just popping to the beach for any other reason, if you happen to have that opportunity. And there are other things that come up around new technologies of different type of litter pickers or different types of bags, or areas where maybe they've just got the litter pickers on the beach already and you just borrow them. And then there are also these feedback loops. There's social contagion. You see other people doing it, you want to do it yourself. It becomes quite a desirable, cool thing to do. Learning by doing is another feedback loop. This idea of the more we do something, the better at it we get. And there are also these ecological and social positive feedbacks. When we do it, there are direct benefits to the wildlife in that area, and also benefits to us. We feel better about doing it. It's healthy, it's active. So all of these things that are supporting this movement to grow, that we can really understand and map these. And then thinking about the triggers with beach cleans, we could point to various things, but one thing might be the release of Blue Planet 2, David Attenborough's documentary, which didn't invent the idea of ocean pollution and ocean plastic is a bad thing, but it really triggered a wave of new information, more people being aware that this was a thing that they could be caring about, be passionate about. So there are ways we can really break down the story that movements tell. And what is it that's going on in there? What is it that makes a story gain momentum? And we can also look at mutual aid movement. So this is something Phil talked about. COVID. During COVID, we saw a huge increase in the rise of mutual aid groups within communities. And again, it didn't come out of nowhere. That movement didn't just appear overnight, however much it felt like it did. The conditions for that change were already in place. So where those mutual aid groups appeared, there tended to be existing local knowledge. People knew who was vulnerable in their community already. There was existing communication channels, maybe a WhatsApp group or a Nextdoor page or a Facebook page. So there was something that was already there that enabled this idea to spread. There were roles and processes. Maybe there was someone who knew what was needed on the street, maybe someone who had a van or a car and could pick up groceries or prescriptions. There were these informal things that could be formalized quite quickly. And there was legitimacy, there was trust, there was social capital and cohesion that these things were built on. So they didn't just happen, they didn't just appear. And then we can also track, well, the story doesn't end there. It's not the end of that tipping point. I'll read this quote out because I think it's quite important, is mutual aid offered by group-based models and social movement networks provides routes to community resilience that support community-led responses to climate change, focused on collective advocacy and care. And what this is saying is this itself becomes another tipping point for more climate action at a local level, because it's constantly creating the conditions and reinforcing the feedback that enables these movements to grow. And I want to end with kind of 3 images, which are from some work that I've been doing with people from around the country and around the world, including Phil, around building a toolkit for working with tipping points. And there's 3 images here that I think sum up some key aspects of why movements are important and the stories we tell about them. This one for me represents this idea of these are lots of different stories woven together, and that's really, really important. But also the acknowledgement that some of these stories might be harmful and might not be serving us. So we have to be really careful about how we interweave these stories of how something changes something else. This image represents the idea of cultivation. When we're cultivating a movement, vulnerability is incredibly important, and we need to take care in order to enable these things to take root. And that cultivation stage, where we're not thinking about necessarily impacts, is incredibly valuable. And then this last image is one of this idea of the unknown. When we're telling stories about movements, we have to liberate ourselves from understanding exactly what is going to happen next. And this idea that we're heading off into the unknown is incredibly powerful and really a really important narrative. But what this also speaks to is this idea of we're doing it together and we're tethered together, and there's a form of safety in that, but it's not complete safety. Just because we're tethered together, we could still fall off that cliff. So there's that tension between the safety in doing something together with the uncertainty of where we might end up. And so just to finish, the last thing I want to come back to is this image I shared at the very beginning, which is something we can think about movements and momentum. And when you search momentum in Google image search, which I did the other day, this is one of the images that comes up. And we can often think about movements as this ball here, and it's creating ripples, it's hitting, but in terms of a story, this is something we can quite see is going to fizzle out quite quickly. There's so much resistance there. There's boundaries to this system that the system is going to quite quickly reassert itself and reassert its dominance. But if we flip the narrative and think, well, actually, the movement here is B, and A is the thing that we are trying to stop from happening. We don't just have to think about movements as making progress forward. We can think of movements as obstructing things that might otherwise have happened. Because unlike the way stories sometimes make us think, we're not existing in stasis. If we don't do something, it doesn't mean that things are going to stay the same. And this feels incredibly relevant today of all days. This idea of a movement can be incredibly powerful just by trying to keep things the way they are or stop them from getting worse for us or for other people. And this idea of telling stories in that way, where we're really acknowledging, what does momentum mean here? Does it mean pushing forwards, or does it mean just creating the conditions for new things to emerge that we might not yet be able to understand, and stopping things that could harm that is a really, really important part of this process, and stories that I think we need to get better at telling. So I've just gone a minute over, so I'll stop there. But yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you so much, Peter. There was so much breadth and so many different ways of framing our narratives in there, and I can't wait to get dug into that later on. I'm just going to really quickly whiz over to Imandeep Kaur now, because she's very limited on time. So thank you for that, and I'm just going to go straight in over to Imi.
Hi guys, can everybody hear me okay? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can? That's cool, because I am in a very unlikely location, as you can probably tell, and I'm just hoping and praying that everything works out. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really gonna share a little bit about the work that we do at Civic Square. The folks at Transition Together talked about, you know, situating where we see ourselves within the climate transition space, and so that's where I'm going to kind of sort of situate most of the talk on where we're at now, rather than giving a lot of background into the big long history of Civic Square, which really briefly started as a young at heart and young people led movement back in the early 2008, 9, 10s, before Brexit, before all of those things, that was focused on what it means to connect people in their places to building more just and democratic places. We then co-founded something called TEDx Brum, then co-founded something called Impact Hub Birmingham, and I've spoken on this platform before, so there are some talks about the history of that. But today I'm just going to talk a little bit about our transition from Impact Hub Birmingham to Civic Square in 2019, 2020, and the work that's at the heart of what we're doing. We're based in Ladywood in Birmingham, which is a inner city urban neighborhood, which is incredible and unique and full of so much creativity, joy, history, and at the same time is completely unremarkable in the sense that it is hugely representative of the future many UK urban neighbourhoods face. And so for us, being really deeply based in the neighbourhood is about demonstrating at many scales the types of transformations we are going to need across many different layers of this work, from how we govern to how we finance to how we organize to the infrastructure we use to how we channel our collective energy and our social movements, as you heard so deeply, brilliantly in the talk before. And I've got some links to some papers that we've written recently about how we see ourselves in that wider arc of change. And so this is a little bit of what our work looks like. I'll talk more about it shortly. But where we situate ourselves within the work is was it at the moment in 2024 going into 2025 is really situated within looking at what is the climate and social and ecological realities around us locally and globally telling us. We released a research paper at the beginning of this year in partnership with Dark Matter Labs, looking at what the impact of our high emissions, the high emission scenario that we're currently on track for. And, you know, we've all heard devastating news this morning about what is going to happen to 1.5 degrees, but we were already on track to breach that. And what that will mean from the big picture, from the science, from everything that we can see locally and globally, but what it's going to mean at the scale of the UK urban neighbourhood. And so we know that 1.5 as a figure was already catastrophic to millions of people around the world. We know that has been true for many decades, and we know that in the global north and in the rich countries of the West, we are due to be currently on a trajectory to continue a incredibly high emission scenario, despite what people are telling you. And at the time of publishing the research, we were at 1.3 degrees. That means today, people are more likely to experience a 3-degree planet at minimum. And to just say, for those of you who have really deeply done climate research, the 3-degree neighbourhood paper is really to show the type of scenarios we may face in extreme weather. Many of you will know that if AMOC collapses, it could go the other way. We could be looking at 10 to 20 degrees colder winters. But the general idea here is about looking at the fact that we as communities, neighbourhoods, as places are completely unprepared for infrastructurally and adaptation wise for the futures that are already here across the world and are on their way for many of us. And this is what we currently look like. None of our current policies and pledges get us anywhere close to the net zero agreements that we have currently in place. They're more sort of good vibes that we think we're gonna head for, and we're looking at minimum at a 2 to 3 degree increase by 2050 without radical transformation. What does that look like in the neighbourhood context? It looks like 3 degrees average global temperature, 5 degrees on land, and 8 degrees in the summer minimum. In urban heat islands like Ladywood, where we are, this could be 10 to 12 degrees experience on the ground. Some of you know in 2022, we experienced one of 6 40-degree summers that we have over the last decade, and we saw 6,000 excess deaths across the UK that were attributed to that heat wave. So we know that we're already starting to see these stories play out, and we'll see them in many ways. And the reason for us for us doing this work was to really situate, if I had loads and loads of time, I would have told you about the 10 years of work that we did with putting people at the forefront of tackling their social and climate and ecological challenges through Impact Hub, through housing work, through childcare work, through work looking at what happens when citizens are at the forefront of designing for systemic and transformative change. But one of the reasons to do this piece of work is that we realized it was incredibly difficult to actually get to a point where you could understand where we were heading. We really felt that it wasn't just about the complexity of the information. I think we all know there's an incredible amount of greenwashing and an incredible amount of hit and hope, that if we carry on in the ways that we are, and we do a bit here and a bit there, we will be able to meet the substantial scale of transition and transformation that's required. And what we also felt was that the actual part of the knowledge and information was hidden from the people who really need it, which is the people in their communities. We felt like communities are deeply infantilized in being able to see the honest truth, see where we're at, to be able to decipher what is happening, what is greenwashing, and so on and so on. So just in case you're wondering, like, why did this group of people get into this deep work? And so we started to look at what these risks were. And of course, if you're in a neighborhood like Ladywood, which is, in the government statistics, one of the poorest, has some of the poorest super output areas in the UK, actually, you'll know that the risks that are being projected over the next 20 or 30 years, particularly in the UK, and the UK Climate Change Committee has talked about these significantly, as have the IPCC. Most people we talk to are understand this far more deeply than many people in power in the UK, because they're already experiencing overheating in their homes. They're already experiencing inability to warm them. They're already experiencing the impact of damp homes, or their homes flooding more regularly. And so these were some of the top 6 risks that we brought out from the research to kind of show what will this look like and what will it mean in the UK urban context. And so we started to really work with our neighbourhood to talk about what this will mean by 2030 and some of the impacts that will have. Of course, the research goes into quite deeply, and this is just some summary slides. I can share the link. That it doesn't take me to tell you that the poorest people and Black and people of colour in the global majority will be disproportionately impacted by these risks. And also that this isn't a new story. This is a story that has been building for many hundreds of years. And so those who find themselves here in the UK as a result of colonization and imperialism also deeply know the impacts of extraction in their places. So whilst people might not be in our neighborhood talking about mineral extraction or carbon budgets, they deeply understand what's happening at home in Palestine or in Bangladesh when there's flooding, or when Pakistan was underwater for half of Pakistan was underwater last year. And so being able to connect those lived experiences of our neighborhoods with what the science is showing, and also historically what their experience is of as people who have contributed the least and are now in the UK and across the world experiencing the worst impacts, was a really important part of moving our work forward. And so I'm not going to go into all of this research because there's a whole paper on it, and I'll share it in the chat. But the reason why I wanted to bring it up was to really say that what we did sort of 10 years into our work was really underpin what is the science showing us, and how can we start to build it into a story that people in our neighborhood, working class, global majority communities at the forefront of experiencing some of the worst material conditions in the UK, but have high levels of social capital and connectivity and communities and mutual aid networks. How can they understand their deep power and potential in stepping into this time and stepping into transition and transformation? And we wanted that not to be based on a kind of shallow hope, but on a deep honesty of where we're at and the scale of transformation that is going to be needed. And so I'll just flick through these just to show that we went into quite deeply some of the research that talks about the actual complete almost delusion when we talk about building 300,000 homes a year. We don't have the material and mineral budgets for this. When we talk about the net zero transition by 2050, the circle on the left is our mineral demand today. The circle on the right is the mineral demand that we will have to extract from places like DRC, from Sudan, from places all over the world in order to meet our own net zero transition in the UK. Therefore, our strategy for net zero in the UK is based on a new age of imperialism where we will extract and we will accept a level of social injustice and genocide across the world to meet the needs of our net zero transition. I think we've heard this story many times before. And so for us, this was really, really important to get the, like, you know, if you're a social media meme guru, get the Delulu out of people's heads. There is no viable transition based on a high-tech, high new build and current strategies. This is what it's going to take. So it means that we are going to have to continuously enact serious global harm, for those of you who know a lot about the donut, in order to meet our local social and ecological needs. And so some of this was really at the heart of like building deep literacy. We'd got the participatory literacy, we'd got amazing relationships, we had an incredible movement, if those of you know our work over the last 10 years. We were part of an incredible ecosystem, but what we felt was that it was based on a very shallow level of actually where we are at and where we need to move. And so then from this, we started to really develop the impact of what it looks like in our places, what impact that's having on people's health, on their lives. We then started to work on what that's looking like more broadly across the impacts it's having in society, what it's costing everyone from Birmingham City Council to national health departments. So going all the way down from the quality of your home and the impacts it's having, all the way to like what is happening at a system level. And so we were like, well, what does this even need to look like? So we talked about what happens when you have low material, we have barely any material budget left. We don't have much time. We're due to completely blow our emissions budget. We are going to be experiencing more and more risk and more crises. But we have this huge and incredible momentum of people, and we can start from our home streets and neighborhoods. So we looked at building into our work a strategy for, together with our community, with our neighborhoods, about what would systemic transformation look like. We don't have much time. If every act we have has to have maximal co-benefits, what would this look like? And over the last few years, alongside all of the work that I don't have time to share about around the neighborhood donut, which I can share the links, and all the work that Civic Square has been doing, we took a next step in starting to build, well, what would the donut tell us about how we would transform our places, how we would retrofit, reuse, deconstruct, build a circular, regenerative economy in our neighborhoods, and what would a strategic approach look like? And so we built out these 6 neighborhood fundamentals and dreamed up what it looks like. With our community, with our partners, building off the donut work, which, like I said, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about. And so all of this is in the report. And it's as a product of lots of years of work with lots of partners. But it looks at what do we do with what we already have and how can we create a co-beneficial, deep interventions into our places, and why are the home, street and neighborhood such a powerful place to start with that. So I can't talk through all of them, unfortunately, but I'm just showing you this. And so looking at our built environment, we've been working through these ideas of things like retrofit, things like big, serious national challenges the government has, and looking at them as deep sites of imagination and social transformation, making them a space where we can look at transforming our built environment, transforming the quality of our homes, transforming and building community wealth, doing the transition around skills and training, building community energy, looking at homes that are warmer, cheaper to run, with better air quality, on streets that are greener and safer to walk on, but really starting at the doorstep of where people were. And for us, it's one of the first times, if you've known Civic Square or Impact Hub, you know, we get in trouble a lot we're like quite on the edge, and we're often really pushing the boundaries. But it's one of the first times, you know, as a slightly more mature, grown-up organization now, that you're seeing that link between a huge problem that national government have, which is the quality of our homes. The retrofit strategy is going very poorly. It has low uptake. It has low trust. Money is being wasted. And you saw in the slides before the impact of a poorly performing home. And so we've been starting to connect these stories up and really looking at this question at the heart of our work, which is, I'm going to move on a little bit because we don't have time for all of these. But a question at the heart of our work is, what if the climate and ecological transition and the deep retrofit of our home streets and neighborhoods were governed, owned, and designed by the people who live there? So this is quite a big shift in many, many different things. And I'll share the slides as well so you can see some of the context that built up to this. But this is really about rethinking where value is created, who gets to keep it, who is designing and owning, who is building literacy, who is building the skills, who is building the knowledge, what knowledge they have in their hands. Are we basing our work on delusion? Or, you know, as Indy Johar often says to me, or he said to me very early in my career, which taught me a lot, which is, you don't want to build a career on palliative care for your community, which is everyone's feeling really good as everything around you is structurally burning, but you can't see it because you're spending all of your time feeling really good in the participation. And that was a really, really hard thing to hear, right? Because it's like a lot of the work we do is about bringing people together and connecting on the skills and wisdoms that they already have, building beautiful, creative, participatory cultures. But his challenge always was to us was, how do you connect that to the scale of challenge we face? And so through our work, you know, there's some logical conclusions we've got to, and I'm just going to share a couple of them before I finish off and can take some questions. But I'll share this entire slide deck because it's got loads of context as well. We know from our donut work, we know from the 3 degree work, we know from everything that's happening all around us that the scale and severity of the poly crisis is going to force us to really reevaluate the speed and scale of transition that's facing us. There is going to be no marginal steps here. We're going to have to rethink the way we eat, we travel, we live, we work, we consume. No part of our lives should be unchanged in the global north if we're to get through this in any sort of socially and ecologically just way. So that means this transition is going to be substantive, structural, and systemic. It's not just going to be something that happens at the margins. It will require us to really redistribute agency, resources, infrastructure, and making sure that we have radical new ways of working in community. We know that there's so much to change in how things are financed. I've got a whole paper on this, which I can share with you, which I'll share in the chat. And we know we need really deep systemic demonstrations of what could be possible. Not just, hey, we got that participatory layer right, but it's still owned by an extractive landlord and it's still financed by you know, fossil fuel invested social investment. We know that every part of this story, from how the land is owned to how it's stewarded to the regenerative finance to how things are governed, is going to need to be demonstrated so people can see it, touch it, feel it, and they can see it's more possible. This is where we situate ourselves, which is we might be based in one neighborhood and working really deeply to build a systemic demonstrator, but we share and work with neighborhoods and partners all across the country, including some of the incredible people that are in this call. And this is not something new, right? This is not like, oh, Imi's out here saying, hey, we need to do a substantive structural transition. It's not going to look like any of the transitions we've done in the global north before, but we have loads of precedents in the UK to build off. We've gone from local working class communities in Tredegar, putting a penny in a week to build worker cooperatives around health at a time where if somebody said, what if healthcare was for everyone, not just for those who can afford it, people would have looked at you and said that you were mad. And 38 years later was the birth of the NHS. Obviously, there was lots of tipping points, and we've written a whole paper on what the tipping points were in this movement, same in the public libraries. But we went from working class communities organizing around their needs to whole new public goods being built. And so the importance for communities like ours is not to just see our work as small and in communities and just kind of palliative care, which is also incredibly important skill, just to be clear. I'm not like here downing that as a whole world of care, but we can situate ourselves as the people and who are the constructors of the new public goods, of people who move the Overton window from what seems seemingly impossible, like healthcare for all was in the time of Tredegar, and building the infrastructures and the movements and the stories and shifting the Overton window and being ready for the tipping points to really show what that new infrastructure can look like in practice. And that's some of what we're doing. Some of you might know that we're just about to buy this site in Ladywood, and we're going to really show what the infrastructure to put communities at the forefront of owning, designing, having access to the resources, building the agency to lead and co-lead their transitions looks like. You'll know that we've done a lot of work on the donut. We did the first neighbourhood donut portrait, and there's a whole workbook around this if you're wondering how to get that started in your home street and neighbourhood. And here's some pictures of just some of what our work looks like, some of the principles that we're working towards. Again, we've got a whole document. We've published a lot this year because we were just getting really aware that a lot of the knowledge was getting consolidated in our work. So I can share a lot about the principles underneath that building and how we're thinking about it, from natural materials to radical redistribution, to looking at going beyond just doing harm or doing less harm, to buildings and infrastructure and spaces that are genuinely socially and ecologically regenerative. And so our work fits into these three demonstrators. We're trying to show what the infrastructure for transition looks like at the neighbourhood scale. We're trying to show what the compass, economic compass we need to follow with working with donor economics and other actors working on reimagining economic possibility. And then we're trying to show what that looks like at the street scale by working with our neighbourhood on street-based, people-led retrofit projects. And so for us, it's like a piece where we work nationally and internationally with many, many people. But in our place, we're trying to really show deeply what new forms of ownership, governance, organising and scale of ambition looks like, where communities can move away from just thinking they're there to put plasters over the problems, but actually can see themselves as the architects of future infrastructures, future public goods, and the futures that we know that are inherently socially, ecologically just and regenerative. So that's where we see ourselves. Hopefully in the next 4 weeks, I'm going to come back and tell you that we've just about to acquire a large site in the middle of Birmingham, which has been, if any of you have been following that work or know things like Atmos for Totnes and others, any community that has been pursuing land, when they finally get there, it's a pretty big moment. So yeah, that's where we're currently at. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you. Oh, that was a real power through. And I just wanted to say thank you and have a proper clap, actually. I know that was a big whizzing for everyone. So feel free to unmute if you feel moved. Thank you so very much. That was just a huge whiz through from all three of you, I think. And then you all touched on narrative and scale. Now, these are both things that I'm really interested in exploring, but we are a bit over time, and I think it's probably more important to hear from people in the audience if you have questions for any of our speakers. So I'd actually just like to open up the floor at this point. If you have questions, please raise your hand so I can see you. If not, I have plenty of my own. But thank you so much for those three speakers. I feel like we've gone through this kind of huge journey in terms of breadth of history, but also in terms of social experience and that global experience as well, which I think is really useful to inform our own group work, perhaps, which can often feel hyperlocal. So I'd be quite interested in exploring that.
I'm hesitating to ask this question because it feels like a question that I don't want to be. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish or over, but what, if anything, gives you hope at the moment? Maybe I just need to hear something, really hopeful about movements. If there's anything you could share that's making you feel hopeful at the moment, that would be really interesting for me.
I'm very happy to kick off. I'll probably go in a bit hard, Hilary, but I guess the myth of the stories of the current economic system and the ways of organizing, I think are coming to an end. I think, I know we're seeing that lurch towards fascism at a pace. and it's devastating, and nothing on any part of that I can really kind of give a story of deep hope on when we've seen the scenes that we have in Gaza. But what I do feel deeply hopeful about is that we have in many ways been starting to build stories across the world of what new economic possibility could look like. And for many people who've been in the emergency of colonization for hundreds of years and been seeing the impact on their resources and on their places, I actually think that the crises and the clash of crises that we will see coming in the decades will open up these spaces for movements like ours and many movements who have been working in that space of what do other economic stories look like, what do life enabling economics look like, what does donor economics look like, what does infrastructure look like. I hold on deeply to what happened in the pandemic when we did have that small window where mutual aid and our communities were able to come together and our supply chains were able to organize locally in ways that no large national systems were. And I know for me, it feels like, of course, like we've lost that, we've gone backwards, but actually that was only 5 years ago and we're in a generational story here. So what gives me hope is that so much of the groundwork and the thinking on what could be possible has been done. And so now it's about our movements really stepping up with the courage to stand up with a better story. What we saw this morning was a slightly different story to the two political parties being pretty much the same on policy with only a few things changing them isn't enough. You can't stand up in front of a nation and say, hey, vote for me, I'm a little bit less worse than the other candidate. So what that means is there is space and time for a new story. I personally think that we are going to see some really dark times before that new story is born, but it is so critical that we don't lose that it is actually our responsibility. When I say our, I don't mean just this call. I mean our generation's responsibility. If we don't do it, if we don't build it, if we don't fight for it, if we don't shift it, nobody else is coming. And so for me, that gives a lot of hope because that adage of the old system is dying, monsters are all around, and a new one is being born. We have to make sure that we don't forget that new one being born is all of our responsibilities. And in that responsibility, I think deep hope comes for me, because if we were just floundering around with not sure what to do, with no responsibility and no understanding, I think that would be actually harder. But in this country, we're part of some of the wealthiest, most privileged people across the entire world. And I think that so many parts of that new story I can see everywhere. And that gives me hope. But I don't think we should see that as a shallow hope. It's going to be a messy, gritty, dirty, roll our sleeves up, deep solidarity, sometimes fight the oppressive story quite deeply type of hope that we're going to need to unlock in ourselves.
Thanks, Imi. I'd just like to extend the question to Peter as well, actually, and then Phil, and then we'll come on to the other questions.
Yeah, just to quickly add, the thing that I think that gives me hope is that a lot of the stories and the things we see that maybe cause us frustration in our own movements for things that feel good and positive to us are also true on the other side of the things that we don't like and feel impossible and awful and horrendous and harmful, in that it's all just kind of movement and momentum and resistance in different forms, and systems either tend towards chaos or they tend towards order. And we have at the moment, a lot of the dominant systems, some of them are systems that tend towards order that are pretending to be chaos. There's a lot of things that happen at the moment that are making it seem like things are quite just chaotic and quite kind of instinctual. Actually, they're very kind of carefully controlled narratives and systems that keep things the way they are. But there are also some parts of those systems that do tend towards chaos. And when we reach those moments where the system starts to lose stability, I think building on what Imi was saying, that's where all of this stuff that's already happening, that has been created, can step into those spaces. and respond to those opportunities that are coming. And so it's that kind of the ability to see things as kind of, you know, non-linear, see the sort of the gaps in the armor of the things that we are pushing against, and the knowledge that things can change very, very rapidly. And just as at the same time, if things are getting worse very quickly, at the same time, we are also seeing the response of the dominant systems change quite quickly. You know, the speed at which local authorities, local governments are coming to things like donor economics and other ways of thinking because they recognize the dominant systems just don't work anymore. It's not enough yet, but it's exponentially rising, and that speed will continue to happen. So it's, I think, noticing the mirroring of you know, what's happening in the things we're working towards is also happening in the things that we're working against.
Thank you. And Phil actually messaged me to say he didn't want to interrupt our wonderful speakers, but I think it'd be quite interesting to have a perspective from transition together on this question, if you don't mind. And then I'll move on to Jackie, then Deborah, then Morris.
Yeah, absolutely, Jess. What gives so I mean, I really I mean, I was going to say the work of Imi and the work of Peter kind of give me hope. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we feel as though that what we're doing is not making a difference. And I don't believe that at all. And if you look at Peter's work into positive social tipping points, everything matters. Every single thing that we do matters. Nothing is wasted because it all goes to build that you know, to build the conditions of change. So everything that we do is important, even the tiny things, even being on this call is really important. And that means that nothing that we do is wasted. And that kind of gives me a bit of hope, that, because it means that we can just keep chipping away at things, you know, that the fantastic stuff that Civic Square does, it's not in isolation. It's all about building that bigger narrative. And as Peter will say, you know, we sometimes don't know what will emerge from that. So that kind of gives me hope, because the future, to go back to the quote about the old world is dying and the new world has not been born yet. This future is unwritten. You know, it's not set in stone. You know, what happens next will emerge. We don't know. And therefore, everything is to play for to a certain degree. But I agree with him. Let's acknowledge that this is going to be dark and this is going to be difficult at times, but it's still all to play for. And yet, this is where the monsters are now. And we knew this was going to happen because that's what is there already. So this is happening as we thought. And that kind of gives me hope that all the work we do can build towards something, even if we can't see that at the moment.
Yes, the role of the unknown, I think, is really fascinating. Yeah. So I'm going to ask Jackie to ask your question, and if I could ask Imi and Peter, I mean, I don't know who you're asking. If you've got a specific question for Imi or Peter, do say. And if I could ask people to keep their responses to a minute, just because we're really close to time.
Hi, I just want to say thank you very much to the three speakers. Such a lot of work you've done. Commend you. A question I've got is to do with movements. You know, if we're working within a quite a small group, a local group, and you know, you all so accomplished of what you've achieved, and we're starting really feels very, very, very basic. Although there's a lot of people with a lot of very good information, but it's very separate. It's bringing it all together is a problem. I was going to ask you a question: is starting a movement or having a campaign, which is sort of, in a way, I think of a campaign as something which has a sort of ending, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It can carry on as a movement does. I feel a campaign is sort of almost easier. I mean, maybe it's just terminology. But I just wanted to get some feedback from your understanding of the difference between sort of movements and campaigns.
Is that to Imi and Peter?
I was thinking that it's campaign seems to be, for most people, accessible. A movement seems like much larger for somebody to organise if you've only got a small group of people. But
sure. I was just asking, is that a question for Imi and for Peter?
Yeah, for anybody who wants to come forward. Imi, actually, because she's been very, very involved from something which is, and she's a super admirational energy. Which
I don't probably have the technical knowledge that Peter does on this, but what I would say is we were born out of a very natural, organic movement of young people in Birmingham. Yes, turning that movement into what is now become and what I see as generational work to build infrastructure and to build out the imaginations and dreams of that movement has definitely turned into many different things, organizations, all sorts, and so on. But just to be really clear, like whilst there are like core people at the heart of it that have been driving it forward and new people always joining and people moving on, where we create smaller movement based work within that, such as Retrofit Reimagined, has been like about them bringing a group of actors together around a certain problem. Within all of that, we do sometimes do shorter term campaigns, or we get involved in other people's campaigns. So to situate it, like, I do agree with you that, like, you know, a campaign's more accessible. If somebody might be involved for a while, we achieve a thing, it's goal orientated. It might turn into something bigger, a movement of people wanting to act on that or changing a legislation or policy. Sometimes it's organic and then turns into something else. And so all I really want to say is I haven't really done the work to like look at the typologies of these different things. Peter might come in on that. But what I do find is that you do have to move to what's appropriate for the energy, the capacity, what's showing up in your place. Like don't try and be what we're doing, because at points we were just a group of people in a coffee shop with £0 and just about figuring out how to get home on the bus that night. Other times we were trying to change a piece of policy, or other times we've been trying to bring all the actors in Retrofit together as a movement. The movement we built happened by accident. So I do think there's a huge part of like recognizing those different tools, but really understanding what the asset strengths, where you are at in your work, and what the appropriate versions of those things are. And the other thing I would say is work like ours always needs people. Don't think you have to start new stuff. So if there are people in your place doing those things and you're like, God, because in physics, the beginning of momentum is the hardest bit. Getting something started is the hardest bit. Then you need people to maintain, give it new energy. So do also think about it from that lens of like, not everything has to be things that you start. And those first followers are incredibly helpful roles to the type of work that we're doing, and people who are in to maintain and build
I think a key difference to consider is a campaign is something that you can create and you can do and you can finish. Whereas a movement, you can't really create a movement. You can cultivate the conditions for a movement to emerge, but there's it's quite a different relationship with that. So I think kind of holding that in mind and acknowledging if you do a campaign, you are going to be part of a movement, whether or not you know it or not. And how much do you need that to be defined is a question I think we all have to come to personally.
Thank you. That's actually a great insight into something I think we all struggle with. If I can move to Deborah, you have a question.
Hi, I know some of you, I don't know others. It's great to hear more about your work, Imi. I'm Deborah Bennett, and I'm currently the co-lead link of Transition Network International. And I guess I spend a lot of time talking about the transition movement and writing funding applications to support the international support system to support the transition movement. And I'm really curious. We know we're almost 20 years old as a movement, and I'm very curious. Like, what do you, Peter? What do you, Imi, think is the potential and relevance of the transition movement? Like, what do we need to do to meet the scale of this challenge now? And those of us that are working at the international level to support the local groups and the hubs, how do we really resource people? How do we actually support people? What do we need to do to help this movement thrive, or to be good allies to other movements? Like, it just feels like there's a scale up that's needed. And I'm really curious how those of us trying to support that can do that in a good way. What do we need to learn? What do we need to do? What do we need to mobilize? Big question, sorry. Any insights welcome. Further conversations also invited.
It's too big a question to fully answer now, but there's I think something about when you support a movement, you know, what is happening, and it's kind of impossible to do that in the way a movement needs to be supported within capitalist charity commission, these kind of infrastructures that are there. So it's not an answer to the question, but I think the answer lies in that tension and how much control you need to have over that movement and your relationship with it, and how you can kind of constantly be in that process of kind of momentum and resistance against the infrastructure in which it exists, that is a manifestation of the system trying to reorganize around what you are doing against it.
Just a really, I know it's probably the last thing I'll say, just a really pragmatic piece on this. I shared a few links, and we shared a piece of work that we're doing on like what's the next frontier, at least for wealth and philanthropy. Like not it needs to dismantle itself, because it inherently is philanthropic capitalism, which we can talk about. And I'd thoroughly recommend the book by Al-Noor Ladder, which I'll share the link of in a second, around post-capitalist philanthropy. It just breaks down why in itself it's not a system that's going to liberate us. So that paper is about the next step it needs to take. So one thing is that structurally the movement needs to consistently be in the conversations around how philanthropy needs to change, not just applying to it for funds. Secondly, knowing transition really well over the years, and all your different people and the incredible work. First of all, thank you for the foundations you laid for people like us, because you absolutely did. And to recognize that's an incredible role you've also played. But my thing wouldn't be to scale up. My advice would be for the networks you already have to go deeper and more honest about the scale of transformations required, building the literacy and honesty in those places, and then organizing not around just the nice bits that are saved for communities or we're told that is our role, and actually taking by the bull of the horns the things that Peter's just talked about, which is we actually going to have to transform the societal conditions within that. And so, you know, some of the projects I shared around We Can Make and Portland In Project, that they're taking those next layers on building the infrastructure, showing what's possible with housing and so on. So I would say the home street and neighborhood is an incredibly transformative scale to work at. The networks you already have are deep and broad. They need to get more ambitious. They need to get more honest. They need to build more literacy. I don't think you need to go and do something else. And that will, and if it means dismantling themselves and going and bringing that energy to a group that has emerged as a result of your incredible work over the last 20 years and giving all the energy there, that's also really important. I fully put our hands up and say we exist now as a result of people like you and others doing the work you did to open that up before us. So there is and there will be a time where we need to put down the reins and open up the spaces for other people to come through. So I'd say go deeper, go more honest, be bolder and more ambitious in what you already have, as opposed to trying to find something new, because you already have so much of that momentum, movement and people and interest and places within your network.
Thank you, Amy. That is deeply reassuring to hear from any of us. Just really quickly, I know you need to go. Morris has a very short question.
Yeah, just very down to earth, I'm afraid. I mean, I'm really impressed with everything you said. Thank you very much. But I just want to have some idea of time scale. I have no idea over what period you've been doing what you've been doing, and it would really help to have a sense of scale over time, if you could. I mean, I know not a precise one, but some sort of idea, please.
Yeah, 2010, I turned up to a coffee shop and volunteered with TEDx Brum. Did that for 7 years. Meantime, built Impact Hub Birmingham from a crowdfunder to a space between 2015 and 2020. Ran that space for 5 years. Learned loads from it. 2019 to 2020. Transitioned to Civic Square. Took everything we learned over that first decade into the ambitious next plan, which is now the work we're doing. So I'm at about 12 years. And I can definitely see, as long as my body holds up and things are in a good place, we've got at least a decade to 15 years work to still do in this space before. And that doesn't mean it'll always be the same role, but I really believe this is generational work. That doesn't mean you always take up power and space in one place and you're always doing the same thing. But yeah, we're 10 years in. A bunch of those years were volunteers. A bunch of those years were only being paid living wage. We're now 5 years into being an organization with wages that don't look like exploitation and an actual team. By the way, we were only exploiting ourselves, not anybody else, just to be really clear. So yeah, about 10 years in.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. And I'm really aware that we are at 9 o'clock, in fact 2 minutes past, and I don't want to be disrespectful of anyone's time here. So I just really want to say one last absolutely heartfelt thank you to Imi, to Peter and to Phil for actually coming up with the idea for this session, which I hope we've all found really inspirational. And I think we've reclaimed a little bit of hope, hopefully. We've looked at scale, and we've also looked at going more where the skills are and where the existing assets are. And I personally think that what's been discussed here in terms of legacy work, so some of the groups and the movements that actually have emerged from transition, I think it's probably worth us talking about that more. Because it's definitely something that I notice as I go around doing the network weaving stuff. But just to bring us to a close, please do feel free to mute yourselves, or give a little clap if you feel like it. Thank you so much to our speakers.